As you all know, this is an attempt at a transdisciplinary seminar on an issue of concern to people from many different countries. As the American Secretary of State said recently, this is our hemisphere. And I suppose the question might be, this is whose hemisphere? And so what we tried to do is bring together specialists in the history of Canada, the United States, and various Latin American countries in order to address the issues that are being brought up at this moment. Now, I think the Canadians, as a general rule, have tended not to think of themselves as being like Latin Americans when it comes to dealing with the United States. And Latin Americans have always told me that that was a rather ineffective way to think about the process. And so what we're trying to do here is to bring different perspectives to bear. Now, what we will have when we can solve our minor technical problems will be the following. Long distance talk by Margaret McMillan from Toronto, a recorded talk by our retired Dean of Social Sciences and an eminent historian of the United States and Columbia, Steve Randall, and then 7-minute presentations from all the people you see sitting in front of you. We should be joined by Amy Kittle later on in the day. And after that, I'm hoping that we will have 30 to 40 minutes for Q&A and for our participants to talk back and forth. Since at the moment we're waiting on solving a technical problem, I think it might be best if I were to ask one of us who are sitting here to start with our 7-minute talk. And so I'd like to ask David Berkeson to begin.
Many years ago, my son was driving an 18-wheeler for an American company in the United States. He was living there at the time, and I used to spend some time with him. He had a double bunker in his tractor, and one day we pulled into a huge pulp and paper complex in Virginia, and I was shocked to see that it was owned by a Canadian company. Now, I did a paper for the School of Public Policy about 7-8 years ago, where I tried to trace the growth of the interrelationship between the Canadian and American economies. And I put the starting date in the 1840s. Two things that the province of Canada, or United Province of Canada as it was called at the time, did in the 1840s that started the process. And the one thing was a standardized rail gauge which was the same as that of the United States, and the second was to abandon pounds, shillings, and pence for a decimal currency. So it was very obvious as far back as then that those colonists saw the future of the economy as being tied to the United States, and that the most access that they could get to the United States, or the more the access they could get to the United States, the better. Now, they were not trying to join the United States. They weren't separatists. They were good British loyalists. But even so, they saw that the economic future of the province of Canada and of Canada afterwards was going to be the United States. It's true today, I think, that when the inhabitant of the White House, whose name I won't mention, begins to say that they don't need Canada for anything, that he doesn't know, that's another thing he doesn't know anything about. Give you one example, which is Canadian lumber. I'm not a biologist. I don't know why Canadian lumber is considered in quality in the United States to be better than U.S. lumber. Maybe it has to do with our cold winters. But it's very clear that they would prefer Canadian lumber when they build houses in the United States, and we send them a hell of a lot of lumber every year. So if he was to do something to try to cut off the economic relationship between our two countries, they would be in deep trouble when it comes to building houses. But the point is, that's why he would never do it. He would never do it for that, and although he's put tariffs on a lot of Canadian products, like I guess aluminum would be one, and copper would be another. There is the interrelationship between these two economies is so deep and so wide that I think it's literally impossible to pick them apart, and certainly impossible for one person to do it over a 4-year period. Now, what does that have to do with what we're supposed to be talking about today? And it is that our relationship with the United States is not like any relationship we have with any other country in the Western Hemisphere. And it's a relationship that has developed over 180 years and will keep developing. There's much more north-south trade in the United States than there is east-west trade within Canada. Now, it doesn't mean that we should not try to expand our trade relationships with Mexico and other countries in the Western Hemisphere. We certainly should try to do that. But I think we've always got to be realistic about the fact that through geography, if nothing else, we have become totally, I wouldn't say totally, we have been largely tied to the American economy, and we always will be tied to the American economy. So what we have to do is get used to the idea that this guy is only going to be around for 3 more years, and yes, he can do a lot more damage in 3 more years, but then his term is over. The problem for us is what comes after that. Could be a perfectly reasonable Mrs. Jones becomes president of the United States, but when is the next Donald Trump coming around? That's what we have to worry about. So I don't know if that was 6 minutes, but that's my take on our relationship to other countries in the Western Hemisphere.
Thank you very much, David. And I called on David to speak first because I knew he could always speak at a moment's notice. Now, I'd like to turn to Margaret McMillan, our friend, and of course a well-known academic and historian of international relations. I'd also like to thank Alex and Amelia for having handled that very complicated technical problem that was getting in the way. Margaret, the floor is yours from a long distance.
Thank you very much. I wish I was in Calgary. It's much better to be there in person, but I'm speaking from a very snowy Toronto. I've been thinking, as we all have, a lot about what this means for Canada's relationship, not just with the United States, but with other countries in the world. We're being forced, perhaps sometimes against our wishes, to think about our place in the world. And we are being forced, I think, to think about the Western Hemisphere in a way that we perhaps haven't for some time. We've tended to take our place in the Western Hemisphere for granted. We've tended to think that we have a special bond and understanding with the United States, unlike those Latin countries, which are rather different from us, that we share a common cultural tradition with the United States, we share a language. But today, President Milei and Argentina are much more valued in Washington than Prime Minister Carney and Canada is. And so I think we are now having to look again at what is going on. And I think the Prime Minister was very clear in his speech in Davos. I do agree that we are living through a time of rupture. We are having to look at an international order, and it's not just in the Western Hemisphere, it's globally, that is now different from what we have grown up expecting. I mean, I grew up when I was born at the end of the Second World War. I grew up during the Cold War. We got very used to that system with all its faults, but it seemed to work and it provided a sort of order. And we're now having to face the fact that that system is broken, perhaps beyond repair. We'll have to see. There were already pressures on the international order before President Trump became president in his first term. The taboo, and I think it was a strong taboo, on the acquisition of territory by force, that territorial acquisition would be recognized by the international community. That was a taboo. Acquisition by force of territory would not be recognized. It had already been breached in the past decades. I would argue that the extension of Israeli sovereignty over a part of the Golan Heights was a breach of that international understanding, and certainly the seizure of Crimea and the attacks, not just on Ukraine, but the attacks by Russia on Georgia as well, again, which involved the acquisition of territory, also helped to break that taboo. And what we're seeing now is something close to a free-for-all. The United States president talking about acquiring Greenland by force if necessary, he says. Russia continuing its war in Ukraine, claiming on very feeble, in my view, very feeble historical grounds that Ukraine is part of Russia and always has been, and Ukrainians and Russians are really one people. And so we're already seeing a good deal of pressure on the international system, but we're seeing also ruptures in what we had taken for granted as an alliance system, which had done us very well. The United States is unprecedentedly, in my view, for a great power, driving its dependable allies away and wooing those that are not dependable. And it's very difficult. I've asked all my historian friends, from classicists up to the present, whether they can find a previous example of this, of a great power getting rid of useful allies. I mean, they've always got rid of the ones that aren't dependable, but now we seem to see them the United States is getting rid of ones that had been dependable. And that also has been shocking, I think, for Canada. We had long prided ourselves on the longest undefended border in the world. We thought that border was inviolable. Yes, in the past there had been disputes, there had been disagreements over where the border should actually be in both the East and the West. But we had come to see the United States as a friend. We had not really felt threatened by American hegemony since the 19th century. I mean, there were raids after the War of 1812, which was a threat before Canada became Canada. But in the 19th century, there were raids across the border. There were the notorious Fenian raids, which were inept and amateurish and easily stopped. But on the whole, I think, since the beginning of the 20th century, Canada might have seen the United States as a cultural threat, possibly an economic threat, but not as an enemy likely to seize Canadian territory. The other border, of course, that we didn't really think much about was the one in the Arctic, because it didn't seem to matter. It was a frozen territory up there, polar ice cap. It wasn't going to be something that we needed to worry that much about, except, of course, in the Cold War, when you had to worry that it would be a flyover for Russian planes and then missiles coming from the Soviet Union. But we are now having to worry about our Arctic border as well as our border with the United States. We got used to the idea that the United States would intervene in Latin America, and I think, although we often disapproved of such interventions, we did not feel ourselves threatened by them. We had protection in our early days, of course, by being part of the British Empire, the greatest empire in the 19th century. And then when, and I think we should remember, the United States was not yet the military and economic power it was going to become. But in the 20th century, we moved fairly easily, with some difficulty, from British suzerainty to that of the United States. And that speeded up, of course, in the Second World War. It was reinforced, the new friendship, by good relations from the top, in fact. Mackenzie King and Franklin Delano Roosevelt were friends. They had known each other for a number of years. Mackenzie King used to stay in the White House when he went to Washington, which was not something that Roosevelt extended to all his foreign dignitaries. They knew and trusted each other. And what we had, partly as a result of intense collaboration and cooperation in the Second World War, we had a whole generation of people in the State Department and in External Affairs who knew each other personally, who knew each other's countries, and who were prepared to work with each other. A lot of that, of course, has gone and is going. We no longer have that degree of understanding, both at a personal level but also at an academic level, between Canada and the United States that we once had. The Canadians still know a lot about the United States, but increasingly Americans know very little about Canada, even, I think, in academic institutions. Nevertheless, we tended to have a faith, perhaps unspoken, perhaps not really examined very much, that we were dealing with a fellow democracy, that somehow we had a special understanding with the United States that it did not have and we did not have with the more volatile, as we saw them, Latin nations to the south. The Monroe Doctrine, we felt, applied really only to Latin America. Now, that was not true when the Monroe Doctrine was first enunciated. In fact, it was directed partly against Russia and the European powers, threatening territory in both North and South America. But we tended to assume, as most Americans did, that the Monroe Doctrine was something that referred to the Latin world. Not that anyone, I think, even today in the United States, is necessarily clear about what the Monroe Doctrine means. Salvatore de Madriaga, the Spanish liberal intellectual, once said, and I tend to agree with him, I only know two things about the Monroe Doctrine. One is that no American I have met knows what it is, and the other is that no American I have met will consent to having it tampered with. And I think we're seeing this today. We all know about, of course, the Roosevelt corollary, that Teddy Roosevelt expressed the view that the United States would intervene in Latin America if it felt that property or American citizens were at risk, allowing the United States to determine when that would happen. But you had that sort of attitude towards Latin America, even among Democrats. Woodrow Wilson said when he invaded Mexico and when he used American pressure in the Caribbean, he put it in more idealistic terms. He said, we will make them Democrat in spite of themselves, or democratic in spite of themselves. And so I think you've had a United States willing to intervene, and a Canada standing on the sidelines, seeing it happen, not feeling that it's something that could happen to us. And so I think we are, as I say, shaken by what's happening in the world order, but also shaken by what is happening in our own hemisphere. And now we have the update of the Monroe Doctrine, the so-called Monroe Doctrine. And if we're asking whose hemisphere it is, I think we also need to ask what on earth is the Monroe Doctrine. It is not, if I can be polite, particularly clear. I've looked at the national security strategy, as some of you have done, and I've now looked at the new national defense strategy. It doesn't really help to clarify what it is that is going to be the guiding paradigm, the guiding scenario of American foreign and defense policy. It talks about the homeland, defense of the most recent one from the Pentagon talks about defense of the homeland as first priority. But we are seeing the Trump administration more and more willing to exert its power overseas, not just in Venezuela, which could be argued and has been argued as some sort of defense of the homeland through these rather unrealistic claims about stopping the drug trafficking. But the fact that the United States now seems to be threatening Iran, moving considerable force into the Gulf and threatening Iran with some sort of as yet undefined punishment, suggests that the defense of the homeland, whatever the Pentagon may say and whatever the national security strategy may say, is not necessarily going to be the guiding principle of the Monroe Doctrine. We should, I think, be concerned, because I think what is guiding, I've been trying to think of what are the guiding, what's the word I want, principles in American foreign policy. Some of it, I think, you can see traces of old isolationism, that we don't need the rest of the world, we will defend our own borders and we don't want the rest of the world to interfere with us. You can see sometimes the old idea that the United States is somehow a better country than others, that what being better means today seems to be better at tech, better at business, better at trade, less of the more moralistic better that we used to get under previous administrations. But I think what we're really seeing is a policy that is being made by one person, the president himself, who wants the glory of being a president, is pleased when there is some dramatic event. I mean, he was heard to comment about the seizure of Maduro, that it made great television. And I think this appetite for glory, which has been known in the past. Louis XIV always talked about his wars being for his own personal glory, I think is very important. Now that there may be, and there are people around the president who have views on what the United States should be doing, and sometimes they get the president to listen to their views, but I think we're seeing a highly personalized foreign policy, a Monroe Doctrine, which will change to suit whatever it is the president wants to do at a particular time. He talks a lot about the great power of the United States, about its extraordinary power, how never before in history has there been such power in the world, how the United States can do whatever it wants. And so I think we are dealing with someone who is guided by personal glory, who sees the world in terms of transactions, who looks at the map, and he talks frequently about maps, looks at the maps and sees nice pieces of real estate to acquire. The pressure to acquire Greenland, it seems to me, is very much that. In fact, he said in an interview, that long interview with the New York Times, that ownership, the New York Times said, why do you need Greenland? Because the United States can do whatever it wants there anyway. And he said there's something about, psychologically, about owning something. And I think that is a very revealing mark. And so this is remark. I think this is what we're dealing with. And I think we have to hope, as the previous speaker was saying, that he will disappear from office one day. Everyone does eventually disappear. And that there will be a readjustment in the United States. But in the meantime, I think what has been lost, and it will take a long time to reconstitute, is the ability to work with each other between nations, is the trust that can be very important between nations. And that can be fairly quickly destroyed and very easily, and not very easily restored. I think for Canada, we're going to have to consider ourselves part of the Western Hemisphere. We have to look much more, I think, to establishing relations with the Latin American countries. We have been talking to Mexico. I hope we're also going to be talking to other democracies in the Western Hemisphere, such as Uruguay, such as Chile, such as Brazil, because I think we're going to need, and again, this is what the Prime Minister said, we're going to need middle powers to get together to deal with a very difficult situation. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Now, Margaret may well be vanishing from our screen because she has other things to do in Toronto. Let me thank you for your words from all of us. Alex, could we put on the Steve Randall? Now, Steve Randall can't be here. As you may know, he's both a senior Columbian and American scholar. But he did agree to record his views on these issues, and we'll see if the technical side works better than it did with Zoom.
If we're trying to understand what's happening with the United States and the Americas, and I'm going to exclude Canada from my comments and to focus more on the Venezuela and Latin America or South America dimension, I think the key words are China, Iran, Cuba, and to a much lesser extent, Russia. There's, again, if you exclude the irrational factor, which is Trump's unbelievable ego involved with the removal of Maduro and the desire to control and take over Venezuela, there are legitimate national security factors at work for the United States in South America. And they're not so much related to narcotics, which is what Trump and to some extent, other U.S. officials have been talking about. China's expansion in South America, less so in Central, but in South America, has really been, over the last 20 years, massive. South America, China is South America's major trading partner. China has huge investments in infrastructure, in energy, in agriculture, in telecommunications. And if you look at Venezuela specifically, there are a number of Chinese companies who hold joint venture rights in Venezuelan oil. China has significant telecommunications investment in Venezuela. China has built the radar system, which somehow failed on the night that the United States invaded. It is also heavily involved in the oil sector, as well as in infrastructure. A second factor is Iran. And I know that this is not often commented upon, but Iran has a very strong linkage with Venezuela. During the Chavez years and subsequently, Iran has developed some 300 bilateral agreements on a range of issues, from energy to other issues with Venezuela. And Hezbollah is well entrenched in Venezuela as well. It has significant networks, criminal networks throughout Venezuela. They are heavily involved in narcotics, as well as in potential terrorist activities elsewhere in the Americas. So Hezbollah is funded primarily through the use of Venezuelan gold, which is tremendously to the advantage of Iran. So Iran is well entrenched in the area as well. I think there are about $12 billion of Iranian investments in Iran. So those are two of the countries and two of the factors which I think are really quite significant in terms of U.S. national security concerns. It has nothing to do with Canada. I mean, I think the Canadian dimension is another factor that we can talk about in another context. The Cuba factor is there as well, but it's a minor one now. It's a kind of sidelight, I think. I think Marco Rubio is anxious to see Cuba disintegrate and to return to a non-Castro type of government. I think it's an ideological and cultural factor with Rubio. It's less important to it's much less important to Trump than I think the China factor. And yet there's something interesting going on. And Trump has assured Xi that Venezuelan oil shipments will not be cut off to China. So on the one hand, it is an effort to undermine Chinese influence in Venezuela and in the continent, I think, as well. But at the same time, since Trump claims that he and Xi are friends, he doesn't want to break that linkage entirely between Venezuela and China. China Venezuela is increasingly indebted to China as huge debts, which can only be paid by the export of oil. Now, whether U.S. companies will go into Venezuela in the near future is another factor. It's quite clear that Halliburton is interested and engaged in a lot of the infrastructure redevelopment, especially in the oil industry. So these are national security issues, I think, much less important on a commercial level. Where does narcotics fit into this, which Trump argued from the beginning was the main reason for putting a virtual armada in the Caribbean and shooting at basically fishing boats and in a few cases much more sophisticated transport to go after narcotics. I think narcotics is a very distant factor. After all, Venezuela really does not produce much of the narcotics. It is a transshipment place, Colombia and further south, Bolivia and elsewhere, much more important in terms of the production of cocaine. So I think narcotics is not the critical factor. If you look at the regime change issue, I don't really see that Trump and the United States is that anxious to see American boots on the ground in Venezuela. They'd much rather see a compliant Venezuelan government. But they're going to have to work with some very hard-line Chavistas, one of whom is Padrino, who is the Minister of Defense, and the other is Cabello, who is the Minister of the Interior, an extremely important figure who controls much of the intelligence network in the country. These are both hardline Chavistas, much less supportive of Maduro, but certainly very strong Chavistas ideologically. Padrino is a general. The military is corrupt. How long it would take the United States to turn the military around to become compliant with the United States, I think is another factor. So it's a national security issue, I think, from the U.S. perspective. The military is heavily involved in narcotics trafficking. It's heavily involved in a range of other corrupt activities as well. And a final factor, I think, is the impact that the intervention has had on what are largely Colombian guerrilla organizations, and especially the ELN, the National Liberation Army. They control much of the border region, and especially in the western part of Venezuela, the northeastern part of Colombia. And they collaborate very heavily with the Venezuelan military. So again, there's a national security dimension there as well. So I think on the whole, I would stress the China factor, the Iranian factor, including Hezbollah as national security threats, and the kind of side issue of the impact of the cutting off of Venezuelan oil to Cuba, the impact that that will have on the Cuban economy, which is already on the brink of collapse. So I think I'll stop there.
I'll say thank you, Stephen, from a distance. Now, yes, please. What I'm going to do to simplify the process from now on is we will move from the far end of the table to this end of the table, and I'll simply introduce each speaker before they start. So we'll begin with Bo Cleland from the History Department, a specialist on American expansion in North America in the 19th century, as well as pirates.
All right. Thanks, John, and thanks everybody for coming out. I thought maybe I would start by maybe proving that Spanish Observer wrong, that some Americans do know what the Monroe Doctrine is, at least historians, because I thought it might be possible that some of you in the room don't know where it came from and what it is. I hope I'm not stealing Sarah's thunder here a little bit. I'll be brief. We have multiple people who know about this. So the Monroe Doctrine was articulated by America's one of the most eloquent presidents, James Monroe, in 1823, in the context of the Latin American revolutions against Spanish control. And the very short version is that Monroe declared that it would be dangerous to our peace and safety, meaning the United States, for a European power to try to reimpose monarchical rule in the Americas, and that this would be viewed as a manifestation of an unfriendly disposition towards the United States. This is fairly mild language, but it's talking tough in 19th century diplomacy. Of course, talking tough when you're a fifth-rate power in the 1820s is easy to do if you don't have to do anything. And the United States really couldn't do anything to enforce the Monroe Doctrine for much of its early history. The United States had no ability to exclude Britain or other powers really from the hemisphere, but it is notable that the only really exceptions or violations of this supposed doctrine came from Spain and France, and that during the American Civil War, when the United States' attention was totally diverted into other activities, such as killing each other. And in some ways, it is the Monroe Doctrine, as it was first articulated, had a noble goal, which is the protection of at least quasi-democratic rule in these continents. Of course, that quickly evaporated into other interests, as you have no doubt aware. One could argue, in fact, that the chief violators of the Monroe Doctrine in the period before the U.S. Civil War was the United States itself. At least between 1823 and 1861, Americans spawned, if not authorized expeditions, attacked Mexico repeatedly, attacked Nicaragua, Honduras, Cuba, Canada even, in the form of both kind of official military campaigns and filibustering expeditions of various sorts, meaning kind of private armies attacking from American soil, attempting to seize these places, often in the interest of the slave power in the U.S. Somewhere along the way, this moves along to justification of American business interests and political, or security concerns. The Roosevelt corollary, which Margaret Macmillan also mentioned, is, again, if you're not aware what that was, in 1903, President Theodore Roosevelt declared that the United States gives itself the authority to exercise international police power in the Americas in the event of misbehavior by Latin American and Caribbean governments. And this is just a unilaterally declared power to intervene. And this was kind of officially disclaimed by the FDR administration in the 1930s, but nevertheless has been exercised repeatedly since then, as we have recently seen. And so I would suggest that maybe the main departure of the Monroe Doctrine from the Monroe Doctrine is not just that it is inconsistent or doesn't exist at all, because inconsistency is obviously not a new feature in American foreign policy. It is rather that this new, I hesitate to even call it a doctrine, but this new pattern of behavior is so bunglingly divorced from any reflection of the national interest that I can tell, or at least the interest of a major portion of the U.S. population. And I'll run back down the history for you quickly just to give you some idea of what I mean here. I submit to you that it was not unreasonable for the American government to be concerned about the reimposition of what they saw as European despotism in the 1820s and 1830s. That wasn't crazy. That reflected the fears of the majority of the American voting public. Seizing territory and expanding slavery in the 1840s and 50s was from the point of view of the slave interest in the U.S., was a logical way to resolve an intractable political crisis at home. It failed and resulted in civil war, but that was the thinking behind some of these expeditions and the annexation of Texas, for example. Interventionism on the behalf of Wall Street interests and the control of an interoceanic canal in the early 20th century made sense for the political and economic elite of the United States in the early 20th century. If we advance a little bit further, screeching, paranoid anti-communism is at least comprehensible in the context of the Cold War and explains much of U.S. behavior in Latin America from 1945 onward. And even the main preview for this latest intervention, the deposing of Manuel Noriega in Panama in 1989, is at least understandable as an act of enforcing norms of kind of political behavior in the Americas and as a fragment of the war on drugs in the 1980s. But this latest business, seizing Maduro in Venezuela, the threats against Greenland, and more, I think lack any connection to the national interest of the United States in any meaningful way. And we've touched on why this might be. We're moving towards almost an authoritarian model here. And I think what we're seeing is the decline of the usual kind of policy-making process, especially that developed after the Second World War in the U.S. And I'll submit to you that one thing that you should all be concerned about with this is, especially after the Grenada intervention in 1983, is the creation of the Joint Special Operations Command and its increasing divorce from the usual command and control outfits and kind of the brakes on misbehavior that apply to the rest of the U.S. military. I experienced this personally in my time in Afghanistan and Iraq. I served in the U.S. Army, in the regular portion of the Army. Ask anyone who served in those conflicts, and they will tell you a story about someone dropping a body on your doorstep or leaving some kind of mess in their wake. They came in a helicopter at night. They're associated with task force, which is a generic name for whatever JSOC group was in your area, and you got left cleaning up the mess. You had no indication whether the people that were killed were combatants of any sort. You may not even know who they were. And this is not a problem that's going away. If you pay attention to what Trump and Hegseth have done in the Defense Department, one of the things they've aggressively done, in addition to removing any people of color from leadership positions, is removing people, especially in the JAG and legal corps, who will say no to actions that violate the laws of armed conflict. I cannot find a legal justification, for example, that would not be murder for these attacks on boats in the Caribbean and Pacific that Trump has authorized. And the people that told them no were removed from office or forced to resign. And so, if I'm a Canadian policymaker, I would be very concerned about the existence of an unaccountable subset of the United States Army with near unlimited funding and a lack of control by the regular forces, who I will submit to you are often suspicious of JSOC's power, but can't do much about it these days. And so I guess I'll leave on that very somber note to say that I don't know how you fix this, but I'm not optimistic that this can be solved anytime soon, because it's been building for the last 25 years or more.
Thank you very much. We'll now turn to Professor Frank Towers, who's an historian of American politics with, I'm sure, interesting views on our current president.
Well, thanks very much, John. Thanks for the organizers of this and for everyone who's here today. So, very brief on my background. I am a historian of U.S. politics. I've also recently been teaching a lot of world history, and I read a lot of political news. And I'm going to try to bring all those things together here by saying, and also making sure I've got my stopwatch going. We have lived through a century of miracles, but it doesn't feel that way. And I think that's a useful starting point. So just a couple of big data facts. The global population in 1920 was roughly 2 billion. Today it's 8 billion. The global GDP has increased exponentially, more than fivefold and higher over the last century. Life expectancy has doubled during that century. The global poverty rate, this means not enough food, shelter, and clothing to get through the day, has been cut by more than half. It's truly been an amazing century, and yet it doesn't feel that way. What's happened? I think if we look at the pace of world history, really our big break point is the Industrial Revolution, which takes off in the 19th century and then accelerates in the 20th century with everything from new ways to grow crops, chemical fertilizers, phosphates, pesticides, the green revolution as it collectively gets known, which produces so much more food to support a much larger population. Fossil fuels, just in the last 50 years, our use of them has increased fourfold, which we'll get to the consequences in a minute, is all this extra energy, extra horsepower in our economy that has been critical to this progress. Improvements in public health, antibacterial medications, all sorts of things that have taken diseases like measles, which thankfully will never ever emerge again as an epidemic problem, and eliminated them from public life. The digital computer revolution of the last 40 years, which has added another stimulus to growth and increased global. We could go on and on. And again, why is everyone so unhappy? Now, I'm not here to tell you that, oh, forget it, everything is great, don't be worried about it, because if we look more recently, we can see some real signs of limits. So if I just, did the quick lazy research of asking, what is the impact of climate change disasters on the Canadian economy, and Google AI says it's going to cut expected GDP growth by about 50%. That is the combined effects of fires, droughts, unseasonably hot, cold, all that stuff, and that's global. Climate change, according to models, is hitting us faster than it used to. Population growth is declining. It was for news junkies out there. China this year lost population. It is not producing people at a replacement rate. That is, births are lower than deaths. That's a phenomenon in lots of developed countries, Japan, Canada, the United States, Western Europe, and perhaps most significantly, Africa. They're not yet at natural decrease, but the birth rate there went from 6 children per family to 4 in the space of about 20 years. It won't be long before the entire world's birth rate is below replacement levels. That is, we won't see another doubling and quadrupling of the global population if those trends continue. I could go on with things that suggest we're at the end of something, and my colleagues are doing a great job of discussing the geopolitical order. Let me say a word about how we got here and maybe help to explain this crisis without mentioning the world's most honest golfer and most faithful husband as part of my talk. Much of that growth in the 20th century had a political shell around it. And it was the Cold War, which I think strangely there's some nostalgia for. And if we think about the Cold War between the Soviets and the West, they were at odds, but they had one big thing in common. They were both very interested in growth. And by this, I mean expanding economic opportunity, increasing wealth as a strategy for their own GDP, but also as a strategy to build alliances. As much as there are all these, brush fire wars out on the edge of this, there's also Soviet dam builders going to, again, teachers going to Cuba, and Americans heading to Africa, and outcompeting each other for giving Green Revolution supplies and so on. And there is this general push to move this forward, and it's under a relatively, not saying stable, but much less conflict-oriented world order than what came before, if you're thinking about the First and Second World Wars, imperialism in the 19th century. That's over. It ended in the early 90s. But in its wake came a kind of after effect, globalization, neoliberalism, whatever you want to call it, where there has been a relative period of global peace and stability around the massive expansion of the market economy around the world, and with it just continuing this stuff. But we're now nearing the end of this, or we're at least hitting limits that seem to be manifesting in our politics. And so I'm going to take my last 2 minutes and mention where all that century of miracles hasn't felt like it. The places that have experienced the least amount of growth in the last 40 years are in some parts of the old industrial heartlands. So we can think of the United States and its Rust Belt. We can think of the old industrial towns in Canada and the north of England and so forth. So if we took everybody's, income and how it's increased, and we have a curve of this, sometimes called the elephant curve, you can see a big increase in the incomes of people in the bottom 70% of the world's economy and in the top 10%, and then very little, almost no increase in the relatively privileged 70 to 90%. But who are those people really? Well, they're the middle class and working class of the industrialized democracies. And sure enough, it's that group that has been telling politicians it's not working for them, has turned to increasingly ethno-national solutions. And we can see it not just in the U.S., but in everywhere really are these far-right parties. Japan, Ireland, Germany, all over the place. What do they want? Well, they're not really thinking about internationalism and global trade deals and so forth. Instead, they're mostly just really dissatisfied with the existing order. And I think if we want to think more broadly about the current crisis, it's underneath it is a lot of very serious long-term structural change that's opening a new period, a period of great uncertainty. I think there's lots of possibilities will emerge, but to end this, one thing that Carney told us last week is that old system's over. What replaces it? Well, beware of living in interesting times. Thank you.
I'd now like to call upon Pablo Polizar, who's a specialist in violent conflict, civil conflict, I think, and also in Latin America. So, Pablo.
Thank you very much. And thank you for organizing this conversation. I'm going to do the classic academic thing, which is to answer a different question than the one before us. The question before us is whose hemisphere? But I'm going to pose a different question, which is what kind of problem is this? So let me start by, I'm going to make 3 claims. The first one is a very simple claim that focusing on the question of insecurity in Latin America, we need to take weak states seriously. And there's been a lot of scholarship on the weakness of Latin American institutions. Latin Americans and Africanists also have paid a lot of attention to this problem. And increasingly, there's a lot of debate on this, but increasingly, we are coming to see weak states in a somewhat different way than we have historically. They're not badly built, strong states. They're exceptionally well-built, weak states. I see some students here who may have heard me say this maybe ad nauseum in the past in different classes. So these are different kinds of animals that we need to understand, not as policy failures, but as political systems with their own logic. So they're organized around fragmented authority, selective enforcement, and the survival of elites. So in these systems, insecurity isn't always a problem to be solved. Often, it's a problem to be managed, to be displaced, or to be exported. So this matters because insecurity in the region is rising. Latin America has the very dubious distinction of being the most violent place on the planet, not because of interstate wars, but because mostly of crime. And that's rising. And this is true not just in one country, but across the region. Take Venezuela. So Venezuela didn't survive years of sanctions, economic collapse, and isolation because it maintained strong institutions. On the contrary, it survived because elites adapted to weakness, to weak institutions. Violence, migration, and criminal activity were externalized. The costs were borne by neighbors and by civilians. They were not absorbed internally, certainly not by the ruling elites. So when Maduro was removed, this logic did not collapse. Internal rivals, and this is really critical to understand, did not defend him. In fact, they turned him in because the system was never about him personally. They dropped him and they repositioned themselves, this time trying to ally themselves with the United States. The fruits of that remain to be seen. So this is what weak state adaptation looks like. Now, there's this problem of rising insecurity is true elsewhere. Countries like my own country in Chile, Ecuador, Uruguay, Costa Rica, Panama, places that were previously thought to be safe, where crime was not really a problem, are seeing an increase in criminality, some more than others. The levels of crime in Chile are still very low, but they have risen and they've caused concern. So once we see these cases together, a broader pattern becomes visible. So rising insecurity is not just the result of local governance failures in this or that place. It's a complex, interconnected regional system in which insecurity is displaced rather than resolved. So that's my first claim. The second claim is that it's useful to see this through the logic of, and the lens of moral hazard. In economics, moral hazard arises when actors don't fully bear the cost of their actions, and that leads them to take greater risks than they might otherwise take. So in the Latin American context, moral hazard means that actors can pursue their own security while shifting the costs of that pursuit onto others. So strong actors, the United States first and foremost, can act decisively through sanctions, through coercive diplomacy like we've seen, or intervention. But they bear only a fraction of the downstream consequences. They displace that cost onto others. So the new US national security strategy, which was mentioned, makes this logic really explicit. It frames migration, organized crime, and instability in Latin America as direct threats to US security. In doing so, it lowers the threshold, the transaction costs for unilateral actions. It makes it easier to engage in this kind of action. So the US doesn't have to engage in complex multilateral negotiations to help resolve a distant problem. Instead, it reframes security not as a humanitarian problem that's present or that needs to be addressed in faraway places, but as a direct threat to the United States itself. So again, Venezuela is a really clear example. Years of multilateral efforts through various regional forums to curb the growing authoritarianism and to facilitate some kind of dialogue or even opening between the regime and the opposition have not amounted to much. And removing Maduro resolved a problem for the United States. It removed an actor openly hostile to American interests. And Steve Randall mentioned the influence of China, in Iran especially, also Russia, and replaced them not with the opposition, but with the vice president. So Maduro is gone, but the regime remains, at least for the time being. So this signals that the US is interested in removing a hostile actor, but not in pushing the system toward even more instability. It's interested in maintaining some kind of order. So Venezuela, I think it signals that the US, for all the criticism, the very legitimate criticisms of this action, has understood maybe the logic of the weak state. So Venezuela is a weak state that doesn't have a monopoly of coercive force, has high levels of corruption, criminal networks that are embedded throughout the governance structure, and a very large population of refugees who have fled the chaos and the insecurity, posing a big problem for neighboring states. So Maduro's removal did not dismantle these criminal networks or reduce regional migration pressure or stabilize neighboring states. But while the US is interested in some kind of stability, it is not necessarily bearing the costs of these factors. Those costs are shifted elsewhere. So in fact, the news every day remind us of the severe tightening of the immigration regime in the US itself. So those costs continue to diffuse outward to Colombia, Peru, elsewhere in the region, the Caribbean, and beyond. So this is a core asymmetry that I think needs to be understood, that security gains are concentrated where decisions are made, and the costs of security are dispersed where power is weakest. And this is moral hazard in practice. So in that context, weak states simply respond rationally to this environment. And to finish, my final claim is that is maybe to consider what this means for Canada. And I think it's interesting that many Canadians are under the illusion that Canada has that the United States thinks of the relationship with Canada as a very important relationship. And I think from the American perspective, a much more important relationship historically is Mexico. Much more important, much more significant than Canada. So Canada certainly needs to engage with Latin America, but it needs to, I think, first figure out what kind of problem it is addressing. And here, as long as we need to understand that as long as security is produced by shifting risk rather than absorbing it, interventions like the United States has just done will look decisive, feel in some sectors maybe stabilizing, but quietly reproduce instability. And so this is the kind of challenge that Canada has to confront. And the strategic problem for Canada is not whether to engage in Latin America, but again, to understand what problem it is actually dealing with. And on that basis, what engagement should look like. So a good start is to understand that security in the hemisphere is increasingly produced by a complex system with multiple moral hazards and weak states that shift risk, because that determines what kind of engagement might actually work. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next presenter is Sarah Rodriguez, who's a visiting scholar who works in the United States-Mexican borderlands, a topic which, of course, is similar to our borderlands of the United States as well. Sarah.
Hi, everybody. Well, I want to thank the organizers for squeezing me in last minute here so I could talk a little bit about 19th century North American expansion. As a historian, my talk is going to be a little bit different. It's going to be a little bit more historical. My aim is to sort of supply a historical context to some of the events that we're seeing happening today. And in fact, I kind of want to give you a brief snapshot of US imperialism from its origins through the 19th century. And in this respect, I'm going to depart slightly from my esteemed colleagues on the panel who have tended to identify the actions of the current US administration as somehow unprecedented. I would argue that they're not at all unprecedented. If you look at the 19th century, American territorial aggression towards its neighbors was highly characteristic. It was discussed all the time. And in fact, 40% of the present US territory was forcibly seized in a land theft from Mexico in an unprecedented act of violence and violation of sovereignty of a neighboring republic that was unprecedented even at the time when it occurred. So I just want us to sort of keep that in mind. So I'm not going to talk, I don't have any solutions, I don't have any answers for you guys. I'm going to stay steeped in the 19th century, but hopefully that will sort of help us to put some of these events in historical context. I would echo some of the claims of my colleague, Dr. Cleland. The United States has always been imperial. From its very beginning, it was imperial. And it was imperial not because it was big and strong and powerful, but because it was weak, right? The United States was the first republic in the Western Hemisphere, the first enduring republic in the Atlantic world. It entered a world dominated by European powers, European monarchical imperial powers, right? Furthermore, Americans themselves knew no other form of government than monarchical empire. Their relationship to republicanism was merely theoretical, and many of them doubted that their republic would even continue to exist, right? So in many ways, it's not really fair for us to even expect the United States to not have empire ingrained within its identity, right? It has always been an empire, but it has crucially fashioned itself as a distinct type of empire, right? Different from European monarchies. Thomas Jefferson famously termed it the empire for liberty, right? So I want to talk a little bit about exactly what that term meant, what Jefferson meant by it, and about the sort of tensions between the theorizing that went around, sort of, that revolved around the Empire for Liberty versus its manifestation, right? Because the reality of the Empire for Liberty has always been very different from the way that it's been envisioned and theorized by American expansionists and imperialists. And if there's one thing comforting to sort of glean from this discussion, it has always been contested and disputed, often by Americans themselves, right? And so that's also something for us to sort of keep in mind. So the Empire for Liberty was supposed to function a little bit different from the British Empire and the rest of the European empires. It would acquire territory, it would absorb foreign peoples, and it would proliferate its institutions, but it would do so in ways critically different than its European predecessors. Its purpose would be to spread liberty, not tyranny, to rule by consent, never coercion, and it would require interestingly, no standing armies or bureaucratic superstructure. Its mission would be to simply spread self-determination by securing economic and political autonomy, first for its own white male citizens, and then for any foreign peoples that it might encounter along the way. So the shock troops of the Empire for Liberty were really supposed to be American settlers themselves, who would sort of go forth into the hinterlands, establish independent farms and communities, and spread the gospel of Republican self-determination. Once enough white settlers had established themselves in a particular region or territory, they would be absorbed as an autonomous state into an ever-expanding Anglo-American republic. Thus, territorial expansion and self-determination would sort of grow together. And this uniquely Republican form of imperialism operated on a series of assumptions. That the spread of US sovereignty and liberty went hand in hand, that US expansion would be consensual and peaceful, and that US institutions were sort of universally applicable and appealing. Now, although the United States remained fixated on Spanish America for most of the 19th century, designs on Canada actually emerged relatively early. Just a decade after doubling its territorial size with the Louisiana Purchase, the US set its sights on British-controlled Canada, with its aim of expelling the British from the continent once and for all, and extending self-determination to its supposedly beleaguered and oppressed Canadian subjects. But of course, for the thousands of indigenous inhabitants in the Great Lakes region, the Empire for Liberty had little to offer. It meant an end to British policies designed specifically to protect indigenous land and sovereignty. And Tecumseh, the Shawnee chief who organized a British-allied pan-Indian resistance, spoke about this. He termed American independence a great evil, since it had unleashed a plague of Anglo-American settlement across the continent and taken native land. Now, the Monroe Doctrine was authored about a decade later, and it's often referred to as the United States' sort of diplomatic declaration of independence. And it operated on the premise that the world was divided into distinct and oppositional spheres, one republican, the other monarchical, and asserted that the United States had a moral and diplomatic imperative to shield the republics of the Western Hemisphere from European colonization. Now, the doctrine was, critically, never about acquiring foreign territory, but rather asserting US control over the hemisphere based on the assumption that any American republic, regardless of its origins, naturally shared more in common with the US than any other power. Now, nothing could be further from the truth, according to many South American leaders, most critically Simón Bolívar, who wrote in 1819 in an address before the Venezuelan Congress that it has never for a moment entered my mind to compare the position and character of two states as dissimilar as the English-American and Spanish-American. Bolívar, interestingly, believed that Britain was a better model for the Venezuelan republic than the United States was. He thought that Venezuela should have a prime minister, a much more centralized form of government, and a hereditary senate, similar to the House of Lords. So here we see very vocal and early criticisms of American foreign policy and its imperial stance towards Latin America. Nonetheless, by the 1840s, the United States had fixated on the region, determined to make it the receptacle of its political and economic guidance, not so much because it aimed to extend liberty, but specifically because it wanted to protect American slavery. And this is a very important transition in the usage of the Monroe Doctrine. By the 1850s, American foreign policy, and specifically the Monroe Doctrine and its posture towards Latin America, is specifically geared towards protecting the sovereignty of slave colonies like Brazil and Cuba, and in many ways violating the sovereignty or undermining the sovereignty of emancipationist republics like Mexico. By the 19th century, Southern slaveholders found themselves in a precarious position. While they were economically powerful, politically they were on the defensive as abolition became ascendant throughout the Atlantic. And Mexico presented a particular problem, positioned as it was on their southern border. By the 1840s, pro-slavery diplomacy and US diplomacy, and I would argue that by the midpoint of the 19th century, they were effectively one and the same, attached a sort of tone of divine intervention to the prospect of US expansion. And expansionists soon set their sights on Texas, a rebellious Mexican province dominated by slaveholding settlers from the South. They tactfully capitalized on US anxieties about British imperial ascendance to garner Northern support for Texas annexation to the United States. So, for example, Mississippi Senator William Walker, who was an expansionist, insisted that acquiring Texas was not about slavery. It was not about extending slavery, as abolitionists insisted, but rather about monarchy versus republicanism, and which of the two forms of government shall preponderate throughout the world, right? So these expansionists are effectively warning against what they call emancipationist imperialism of Great Britain, right? But they're constantly framing the conflict not as slavery versus abolition, because that wouldn't gain much sympathy in the North, but rather as monarchy versus republic, right? What they were really talking about was slaveholding republics like themselves, right? But many people disputed this, right? Abolitionists specifically insisted that Texas represented nothing more than a pro-slavery plot to add, as they put it, 9 more slave states to the Union. And they queried what this would mean for the United States standing as a beacon of Republican liberty, right? What would it mean for its relations with the non-slaveholding societies of the Caribbean? In other words, fearing that the United States would alienate itself ever more from the rest of the world if it adopted an aggressive stance towards Mexico. And perhaps the clearest evidence that this stance represented a corruption of the Monroe Doctrine was the fact that its own author, John Quincy Adams, so adamantly opposed it. He said that if the US were to annex Texas, that the banners of freedom would become the banners of Mexico, not the United States. Yet no one exposed the lie of US imperialism more powerfully than Mexican leaders themselves. To them, the Texas Rebellion and subsequent annexation represented the true nature of America's supposed empire for liberty. Mexican leaders not only rejected the idea that the United States embodied any sincere commitment to the precepts of liberty, equality, and self-determination, but many of them claimed the role for Mexico. U.S. acquisition of Mexican-controlled territory represented not only a threat to Mexico's sovereignty, they insisted, but to democracy and equality throughout the Western Hemisphere. So here we see Mexican leaders actually adopting the same stance that the United States did under the Monroe Doctrine, although less officially. Indeed, no conflict seemed to sort of confirm this more than US imperialism, more clearly than the United States' theft of over half of Mexico's territory in 1848. What scholars now term the War for North America was propelled explicitly by pro-slavery interests and fueled by racist rhetoric that cast Mexicans as barbaric, weak, and incapable of self-government. The conflict was also deeply divisive in the United States, where it was denounced as a senseless and wasteful act of aggression against a neighboring republic. Now, Frederick Douglass predicted that the United States would not go unpunished for its aggression towards Mexico, and he was right. The Mexican cession posed an unresolvable question for the United States, and that was whether slavery would be permitted to extend into the newly acquired territories from Mexico. when Abraham Lincoln won the 1860 election on a platform of non-extension, it triggered secession. So this is one of the great ironies of 19th century US history, that at precisely the time that the United States acquires this vast territory from Mexico, emerges as a continental empire effectively, it actually ends up paving the way for its own destruction, right? Without the Mexican cession, without the acquisition of these territories, and the critical question of slavery's status in them, we likely wouldn't have had the Civil War. Now, following the Civil War, the United States would pursue a distinctly domestic form of empire as it sought to integrate the recently defeated southern states and unincorporated western territories. Now, although this form of empire remained contained within its borders, it helped establish a kind of arrangement that would later define its overseas empire. The first component, and perhaps the most enduring, was a marriage of private capital and state power. An expanded US military was unleashed upon native sovereignty, and even though self-determination had been at the core of the original empire for liberty, most of the people inhabiting the recently acquired territories would remain in a status of semi-citizenship indefinitely, in direct violation of Jefferson's idea of an empire for liberty. Indeed, perhaps the greatest irony of US imperialism was captured in the remarks of Filipino independence leader Emilio Aguinaldo, who in 1899 wrote, "You repeat constantly the dictum that we cannot govern ourselves. With equal reason, you might have said the same thing over 100 years ago. Did America recognize this fact, she would cease to be the laughingstock of other civilized nations, as she became when she abandoned her traditions and set up a double standard of government. Government by consent in America, government by force in the Philippine Islands." Thank you.
We now move toward Rob Hubert. Rob is the director of CMSS, and he's also one of the leading figures in studying Arctic security.
Thank you, John. I'd like to thank Alex, John, and the audience for coming and engaging upon this very important topic. I think the fact that we have so many people out here that are, in fact, trying to come to an understanding of these very as one of my panelists put it, interesting times as we try to understand it. I'm here to talk on the upper part of the hemisphere as we try to reflect upon the Monroe Doctrine in the manner in which the Americans seemingly are now trying to bring it forward. Once again, from a historical perspective, when we start looking at the application of the Monroe Doctrine, the idea of hemispheric control, I mean, we have to think of two elements. The first element, of course, has always been the bugbear of Canadian Arctic sovereignty, and that is whether or not the Americans actually wanted to take control of the Canadian North, and particularly after the Second World War. In this context, of course, we see that despite the warnings of Mackenzie King, who was very concerned on this issue, particularly when the Americans set up a series of military bases to deal during the Second World War, and then subsequently at the beginning stages of the Cold War, when we had to take defensive means against the Soviet threat, the overall assessment of most Arctic historians are that, in fact, that the Americans were very well behaved. They came in, they did what they said, they pulled out when they did, they were willing to engage in terms of a cooperative agreement for aerospace defense in which they did assume most of the major costs, and we presumably were able to gain most of the benefits. So in that context, with the exception of the two issues surrounding the status of the Northwest Passage, we've seen a behavior that doesn't follow what many of the political elites were concerned about. Now, if we turn our looks to the issue that is now the most prevalent within the media attention right now, and that is, of course, the issue surrounding Greenland, again, also from a historical perspective, it's interesting. At the time when the Germans were able to invade and defeat Denmark, it was the Canadian government that was thinking that it needed to move in to occupy both Greenland and Iceland. we did in fact go ahead. We were the original occupation force of Iceland in order to try to prevent the Germans from coming in and taking control. But when we raised the issue of going in for Greenland, what was interesting, a still neutral America said, I think we would rather do it. We don't want you going in because we think if we go in as a neutral country, we have a better argumentation for trying to contain the Germans. And there's some suggestions that they were also concerned that we were really just acting as a conduit for the British in order to be able to expand. Now, again, we have the occupation of Greenland by the Americans. The Americans subsequently replace us in Iceland. But at the end of the Second World War, they do leave. There are some concerns within Denmark that they're going to have difficulties, but again, the performance is similar to what we see in the US. Do what we want in terms of our core security issues, and we won't challenge your sovereignty. We'll work with you. And so we see the Americans pull out of Greenland at that point. But then, of course, when the Cold War breaks, and by 1947, and by the realization that, in fact, that with the new technologies, nuclear weapons and the new delivery systems, first of all the bomber, and then subsequently the missile, the Arctic became the point of trajectory. And so that becomes the center of attention of the Americans. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Denmark, of course, is one of the founding countries, along with the United States and Canada, in the creation of NATO. NATO is, of course, a defensive means against the Soviets. Now, what happens is that the Danes are very happy to talk to the Americans. As early as 1951, they signed an agreement in which the Americans basically can do anything that they want when it comes to security. Now, the American major bases are to the north, where the population centers are thinner, but there are some population centers along the coast. Thule, where they have one of their most important bases, now known as Piftuck, did have a community in that context, and that's one of the reasons they selected it. But the population of Greenland is on the coast. It's a little bit more south. Now, we know, again, the Danes let the Americans do whatever they want, including nuclear weapons, because in 1969 there was a broken arrow incident. And a broken arrows, of course, is when nuclear weapons are lost. And what happened was a B-52 crashed overflying Greenland. We're not quite sure if they were actually basing some of the weapons in Greenland. Some of the literature is a little bit mixed. It might have been that the Americans were based in the US or the European and were flying over, or they might have actually been storing, but they were doing the overflights. They crashed. They recovered 3 of the nuclear weapons, but they never recovered the 4th one. And again, what was interesting is that there was no outrage by the Danish government, or we saw a little bit of protest in '69, but not to the degree that you would think that such an incident would create. And so we see in that context that, in fact, that there was a good relationship. Now, go fast forward to the future. So the Americans have worked out a good system with Canada for NORAD, and NATO with Greenland working in terms of the surveillance. The other part of the puzzle that's not being discussed right now is, of course, the NATO countries basically protect the southern flank. It's the NATO SNIFL division, the maritime side, that develops the ability to control the southern maritime flank, the GI-UK gap. Now, the Americans never have enough ships to be able to maintain it in terms of the Soviet threat. And the argumentation today is they still don't have that capability. That's why we're now doing within NATO, and Canada is included, what's called Operation Dynamic Mongoose, which is relearning how to do anti-submarine warfare. And again, the predominant countries that are doing it are not the Americans, because the Americans have an issue that they are losing capability in the type of anti-submarine ships that they need. They've really screwed up on a couple of classes of vessels that took monies from what they should have been spending in sort of your classical destroyer. So they're relying. So we take it up into the future. We get Trump. Trump comes forward and he says, of course, well, I want to own Greenland. And the first term, everyone laughs it off and says, okay, this is just Trump probably getting briefed about the elevation of what the Americans are doing in what was then Thule. Because this is a period that the Americans are integrating Thule from just being sort of a listening post in most of the post-Cold War into developing it into an integral part of what we are now calling the Golden Dome. But this is, of course, the stuff that General Van Herk, who was the commander of NORTHCOM, and NORAD had said, we need to have the ability to not only detect the hypersonics, the low altitude, we need to be able to shoot and sink the Russian crafts that are carrying them. It's the whole principle. You may come across it, you'll see him making reference to killing the archer instead of just simply stopping the arrow. And so this was all undergoing. They've expanded the airfield, they've brought in Space Command. In other words, everything that you could possibly want from a security perspective, you were getting. And so when Trump comes forward in the second term and says, I'm going to take over Greenland, once again, we've heard about the psychological element of it. When he says, I'm going to take over Greenland, all of a sudden, all that good cooperation becomes questionable. All of a sudden, we see in Canada, the discussion, and those of you that read the Globe and Mail today will know that we're thinking about getting an aircraft that will be subsequently inferior for meeting the Russian and the Chinese threat. Now, we are, of course, thinking about having a mixed fleet. That is, instead of just having the F-35s, which is the system-of-system aircraft that we need for being able to counter the Russian threat, now we have to dealing with the political threat of the United States. As David said, maybe that threat will disappear after 3 years, maybe it won't, but the reality is that we are now lining up to get an aircraft that we will keep running for 40 years, and the question is, can you meet the Russian and Chinese threat, or is it more important to meet the American threat? And that is the debate that's occurring in the Carney government right now. They're trying to make that decision. On the southern tip, the Americans don't have the naval capability of doing the anti-submarine warfare against the Russians, and so that means that they've just disrupted their ability to hold that boundary. Now, where this leads us in, and where I'll conclude, is that from a strategic perspective, from a security perspective, everything that Trump is doing right now seems to be a master plan to allowing the Russians to be successful. I'm being a little bit snarky on the particular element, but you look at the harm he has done to NORAD. Canada may buy an inferior capability of meeting the hypersonics. Denmark is talking about canceling some of its 35s that it is going to be buying. They're going to be making a huge problem in terms of naval cooperation, in terms of protecting that flank. So all of a sudden, Trump has actually opened up the Russian ability to get their submarines that are carrying the maritime launch cruise missiles that Van Herk was so terrified about. They've opened up the possibility of the North. And then, of course, the ultimate is Trump now thinking about seizing Northern Territory in terms of being able to place the American position. But I can assure you, despite where you may think in terms of what we have or haven't done for modernization of NORAD, and I'm one of the major critics that we have not acted early enough, our capabilities are such the Americans are going to have great difficulty doing it themselves if they seize territory. Right across the board is that the Trump actions on the Monroe Doctrine is making all of us much more threatened by what the Russians can do and presumably what the Chinese are thinking.
Thank you. And finally, we'll call on Dr. Hendrik Cray, who's a leading specialist in Brazilian history.
Yes, thank you, John, and thank you, everyone, for staying this long. I'm not sure if it's a good thing to be the last speaker after a panel of this length, because lots of things I did want to say something about have been mentioned in one form or another. But on the other hand, there's a lot of stuff that we haven't actually talked about, and I actually want to take this, very much contrary to my disciplinary training, into very contemporary issues and some things to be looking forward to in the next months in South America that may tell us something about where all of this is going. And particularly in terms of South America, 3 of the 4 largest countries, 2 of which share borders with Venezuela, have presidential elections this year. And I'd also like to make an argument connected to those that the answer to our Roundtable's title question is quite a bit more complex than the advocates of the Monroe Doctrine claim. And I would start with one observation that's been widely reported in the media. I think lots of people know there's been a very muted reaction across Latin America to the overthrow of Maduro. We just don't see any of very little of the Yankee go home rhetoric that we all grew up associating with Latin America. significant polls are showing significant majorities in countries or large pluralities actually support U.S. Overthrow of Maduro, which says something about how obnoxious Maduro has made himself. And I think there's some context here that we can help understand the situation that'll also help us to see something of the limits of U.S. power in South America. First of all, of course, we have to talk a little bit about the right-wing shift in the region, but at the same time I want to suggest some limits to that. Perhaps I will sort of skip some of the things I was going to say about growing Chinese economic importance in Latin America, because Steve already talked about that. And Steve highlights this, the main story is this quarter century of growing Chinese investment trade in Latin America in all sorts of sectors, but very much in South America. And here we have to remember that in Latin America is not really a useful category in many ways, because Mexico is in a completely different situation. 80% of Mexico's trade still goes to the United States. Mexico, just like Canada, go to the largest country in Latin America, 10%, 11% of Brazil's trade is with the States, 30% is, or thereabouts, is with China. So it's a completely different kind of dynamic across the region. Right-wing shift across the region, and we've mentioned a number of names have come up, and we could go on about Nayib Bukele and the prison that so fascinates the MAGA folks in the United States, or Daniel Noboa is doing similar things in Ecuador, Jose Antonio Cast in Chile, who won election with a promise to build border walls and various other things. But even places that we used to associate with more toward the liberal side of Latin America, Costa Rica, it looks like Laura Fernandez is going to win probably the first round, continuation of the populist right-wing government in that country. And Costa Rica is actually building what's going to be like, if I can call it that, a mini mega prison modeled on the El Salvadoran one, which this is not the sort of thing we associated with that country. And of course, Javier Milei has been mentioned already in Argentina, and what's really remarkable there, although not really connected to an argument I'm making, but is how much popularity he's managed to maintain for his extreme right-wing reforms, which I think says something about how just so discredited the Peronist left has become in Argentina. And then, on one level in Latin America, we're very much on a different context than the pink tide of the first couple of decades or 15 years or so of Latin America, Latin American history. There's a lot of reasons why these changes in Latin America have taken place. One of these, and some of these connect to some points that Frank made in his presentation. Since the end of the commodities boom around about 2013-14, the decade since then comes pretty close to a decade of no per capita economic growth across Latin America. And so really we could start talking about this as another lost decade, although it doesn't work as roundly as the 1980s did. Growing concern for crime, that's come up a lot across the country. Certain discontent, discrediting of democracy, it seems to have failed to deliver on some of its promises. And that's something, again, that connects very much with what Frank said. Cynicism about the state's capacity to do things, unfulfilled rising expectations, perhaps from the boom years. The rise of precarity in individualism, one of the things that keeps coming up, people commenting at it, that all the Uber drivers in Argentina are fierce supporters of Milei, even though arguably they'd be much better off with a different type of political economy. And of course, effective deployment of culture war rhetoric in a region where evangelical Protestantism has made very significant inroads. So we've got lots of things to say about the right-wing reaction. That explains something of how Latin America has reacted. But I actually want to go in a different direction, because even if we talk about this, we still have 3 of the 4 largest countries in Latin America that account for close to 2/3 of the population and economic activities are still governed by the left. So the vast majority of Latin Americans are still under left-wing regimes. That's, of course, Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil. And 2 of those countries then have elections, and a 3rd country as well that I want to say a few words about coming up in later this year. So in South America, Brazil, Colombia, and Peru have presidential elections later this year. First one up is Peru, and Peru is a really tricky one to figure out, because at the moment it seems to be like there's 36 candidates running, and the top one in the last polls is from extreme right, Rafael Aliaga's running about 13% in the polls. The next one is another familiar right-wing figure, Keiko Fujimori, running again for president, coming in at 7 or 8%. So Peruvian election is completely impossible to predict, and one might end up having, as happened the last time, a last-minute left-wing candidate squeaking into the second round and then coming out on top, as Pedro Castillo did. But Peru is a good example, too, of a country that's thoroughly integrated into the Chinese economic orbit. Larger part of its trade to China. The Shanghai port is a massive port that's connecting the Pacific across to China through Latin America, through this port. So Peru is, again, a country where there's very little sort of economic influence of the United States. In Colombia, Gustavo Petro is the first left-wing president in modern Colombian history. He's had a lot of run-ins with Trump right from almost the very first week of Trump's administration. There was lots of loud rhetoric, and more recently over issues of deportations, drugs, despite the long history of sort of anti-narcotics cooperation between the U.S. and Colombia, something, of course, we used to be very critical of. But there seems to be a pattern of relations, of a verbal escalation between the two, followed by a phone call and a de-escalation. And the latest, after the Petro's reaction to the overthrow of Maduro, quite critical of the United States, and Trump said lots of nasty things about Petro. But apparently had a phone call, and now Petro seems to have an invitation to go to the White House next week, and remains to be seen whether that will actually happen. But of course, Colombia is a little different situation. It's the one country in South America that still has more trade with the United States than with China. It's a slightly different situation. Colombia historically, of course, been a right-wing country, and the elections, first round scheduled for May 31st. Current polls still show Ivan Cepeda from the left leading at 30%, but it's still very early because the center-right really has not defined its candidates yet, and it's certainly, if I was going to hesitate a prediction, it's more likely the center-right will win once they define their candidate. Let me end my remarks by saying a little bit about Brazil, since that is the country, as John pointed out, I do study the history of that country. And here Brazil is a really interesting case, of course, the second largest country in the Americas. And here, of course, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva is completing his third term as president after a really remarkable comeback from prison. He intends to run again at the age of 80. That's, of course, highly problematic, as we've seen in the United States with some elderly presidents. Not that I'm being ageist or anything, but in Brazil, this is evidence of the PT's complete failure to develop another leadership core. If Lula really does run in this presidential election, it will be the 7th presidential election of the last 10 in Brazil that he's been a candidate all the way back to 1989. And Brazil is also, of course, really interesting because of the parallels between the former president, Jair Bolsonaro, the so-called Trump of the tropics, who's now safely behind bars in Brasilia, serving a 27-year sentence for plotting the coup in late 22 and in the incidents of early 2023. And that's such a sharp contrast with the United States, and says something about institutions, and maybe institutions work in some places, to raise a question a little bit about Pablo's model of weak states. Okay, one little story about Bolsonaro is actually working now to whittle down his sentence. He's exhausted all the other appeals and options, and now he's doing it. He's enrolled in a prison reading program, which in Brazil allows people to get, prison inmates, to get 4 days off of their sentence for every book they read and write a book report about. There's no indication if he's able to use ChatGPT for that. So anyway, neither here nor there, but there's just too many stories that we should maybe laugh sometimes because of the absurdities of the world that we live in. Bolsonaro's son, Flavio, is being touted as his father's successor, but he tends to lose in the polls to Lula. There's actually been some indication of an uptick in support for Lula since Maduro's overthrow, but it's really too early to tell still, as the center-right are far from consolidating their candidates. And Bolsonarismo is really quite divisive on the right in Brazil because there's plenty of strong candidates who would like to have their turn and really don't much care for the Bolsonarista nonsense. And it's also interesting is how effectively Brazil has been able to defy Trump on issues around tariffs, that Trump put on over issues of the prosecution of Bolsonaro, regulation of social media, and a few other issues. And Trump imposed these very high tariffs on Brazilian exports to the United States, but had to roll them back in late last year around coffee and beef in particular, because he was trying to control food prices in the United States. And of course, Lula's defiance wasn't a very difficult decision. Only 11% of Brazil's exports go to the United States. And in lots of areas of Brazil and the United States are really very competitors, and Brazil is competing very successfully. Brazilian soybeans have something like 75% of the Chinese market. The U.S. Was not able to sell soybeans to China until Trump made that deal the last little while, but that's only a fixed amount that China is going to be buying. And Brazilian soybeans are going to China with a lower tariff, and given the bumper crop that the agricultural observers are predicting this harvest season that's starting now, Brazilian soybeans are going to be cheap, and they're going to be undercutting those from the supply from the United States. At the other end, of course, there's all kinds of very interesting things going on in terms of rapid inroads of Chinese automakers in Brazil. Very tellingly, BYD, to build your dreams, the electric car company. I'd love to get one of their cars. They're so cool. I saw lots of them in Brazil last week. But that company has bought out an old Ford plant in Hemisphere in Brazil, converting it into a major production facility intending to supply the all of the South American market. And that's kind of telling of the kinds of switches that are happening. But I guess I'm getting at as a suggestion here is that, particularly for Brazil and for a number of other countries across South America, Trump doesn't have a whole lot of leverage. If he believes that tariffs are such powerful influences on trade, maybe that works for Mexico and Canada, but it doesn't work for a lot of South America. And so basically the argument here is the U.S. conceit about Latin America as the U.S. or as the Americas as the U.S.'s backyard really doesn't very well describe or reflect economic and political reality. It's not Uncle Sam's hemisphere.
Well, I think we can all take a deep breath. We've run through lots and lots of different issues. We do have time, about half an hour, for Q&A. I think Alex is going to be taking a microphone out into the midst. All I would ask is that you make your comments or questions succinct, and whatever comments any speaker wants to address, so far as I possibly can do, I will let them do. And if anyone needs to go now, I understand. So, any questions?
Hi, I'm Joe. I work at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. So thank you all so much for this fantastic session. Very interested in this subject, of course. I guess my question is more about whether the current trend, or if we can call it a trend in the United States, whether this is a break from continuity, a return to continuity, something else entirely. I think that there's a few narratives about kind of the nature of kind of American foreign policy and American stance toward other countries in the Western Hemisphere. So I guess my question is, should we see this new policy under Trump as a real break from continuity that goes against U.S. principles, or as something that's more in line with base U.S. principles that we were talking about, where it comes to, let's say, the annexation of Texas and California from Mexico? So that's my question. Is this a break from continuity, or is it a return to continuity?
Do we have a microphone up the front for Frank?
I've got a really loud voice, so I probably don't.
Okay, good.
I'll take a quick answer to that. Of course it is. I mean, having a U.S. president attack Canada the way that Trump has is not something that's happened in anybody's lifetime. And what's especially interesting about it, if we think about Latin America, is Trump seems to have a foreign policy that is, if there's a far right party in charge, I'm your friend. But if you have a centrist liberal party, you're somehow the bad guy. Now, we could take a look at what happened in Argentina with Milei and Trump saying, "Oh, it's a national security reason I have to support them," going after, dumping on Trudeau a lot, and the latest remarks by Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, in favor of Alberta separatism. There's some sense where there's a global right at work here, and they are. Especially run by Steve Bannon. He's been a big advocate of this in the Trump administration. All that stuff is brand new. But then I'd point back to what Bo and Sarah were saying, and the U.S. has been a hemispheric hegemon. Some of this fits with that longer narrative, but I do think we can't ignore Trumpism as part of a new formation globally, which is this populist right resentment stuff that really, hasn't been running these governments in any time in the recent past.
I'll just add that if we're thinking about whether this is kind of a continuity or a break in terms of American policy, for me the break is in at least either the sidelining or the discarding of the traditional policymaking structures that have been built since the Second World War at least. And that's where, if I'm an outside observer of the United States, that's what I'm worried about, is the lack of predictability in governing structures in the U.S. He's sidelined the National Security Council. You've got, in the Defense Department, you have a guy who is, I'll just be open with everybody, people who do not respect the National Guard in the United States, and you put a National Guard major in charge of the Defense Department who was a TV show guy. That tells the long service professionals that their expertise is not valued or going to be listened to. And so people are leaving the government service, or they're not, or the wrong type of people are going to stay in. If we're looking, if Democrats return to power and somehow the old foreign policy blob returns to prominence, maybe this will be just a blip. But if that's not the case, and I worry that it won't be, I would be really concerned that the break will not just be in terms of practice, but in terms of what expectations you have for stability in American policymaking from kind of across the foreign policy apparatus of the U.S. government.
Alex, do you have a...
Thank you very much for all the interesting talks. I'm Vincent Alt. I'm a German exchange student here for the term. I'm not, particularly concerned with, whether or not the hemisphere is only the U.S. ones. It's kind of beyond the pond kind of issue for me, or at least for my home country. What certainly raised my interest was that in most talks, the Monroe Doctrine was mentioned, and although there were remarks on how it's hard to define whether or not it is really unprecedented or not, and to which degree the national policy of the U.S. is shaped by the current president, I got the impression that naming it as a doctrine basically makes it seem like it is a very thought out, established strategy that isn't just depending on the individual thoughts of the current president, but goes beyond this. Although, as we have seen in the talks, it isn't really, easily accessible through, for example, the national defense policies and national security strategies and all that. So my question would be, in your opinion, is the Monroe Doctrine basically even there? Does it even exist, or is it just a way for the administration, the current administration, to phrase their seemingly erratic behavior as something that has a greater goal? Thank you very much.
All right. It's long. All right, perfect. I honestly, I don't think it works as a doctrine. If you go back over the last 50 years, practically every president had some kind of doctrine named after them that has had no staying power in American foreign policy. In this case, I think this is more a clever quip from a TV game show host who Monroe, that rhymes with Don. I can make a joke about myself because you got to give the guy credit. He is funny. And I think, honestly, this is a quip that the rest of us, are trying to make sense of a world that has lost some of its moorings. And I feel like observers have seized upon the doctrine part of this as having some explanatory power that it maybe doesn't hold. I honestly, I don't see any consistent policy being built out of this, at least so far. Time may tell, but I think it's a game show host quip, is what I think.
I'd second that. I think the way you framed the question, I'd agree with. This is just, Trump likes to put his name on stuff. So Monroe Doctrine, I'll do that. I also think that the immediate aftermath has sort of shown the limits of this big rush in the first year of the Trump administration to kind of, move fast and break things. That he moved away, quickly, has just backed away from the whole Greenland scenario, which in itself was another effort to change the channel from what was happening in Minnesota, which hasn't worked. And if we're really following this minute by minute, the administration is in a lot of trouble in terms of its public support in the U.S. right now. Does that mean it's all going to end? No, but does it show the cracks and really weakness of so much of Trump's global project? I think that's true.
Maybe I'll just weigh in on this as well and do the same thing and answer a somewhat different question than the one that was posed, which is that regardless of what we may call it, I would take Mark Carney's statement that there's been a rupture as accurate, and that something has changed. And so I'll let the historians debate whether the international liberal order, the rules-based order, died this past year or whether it died many years ago. I know many political scientists have been arguing that world order had been on its deathbed and dying for a very long time, and good riddance too, from some perspectives. Regardless of what we call this new thing, whether it is a new thing or simply just Trump putting his name on things, something has ended. And so maybe the question is, well, what will replace it? And whether it's this particular doctrine, whatever we want to call it, or not, I would think that maybe a way to think about it is that there's something that Trump is proposing here, but there's also competitors. Mark Carney put forward a vision as well that was a different vision to challenge Trump's doctrine. The BRICS countries are also putting forward a different vision that is in competition with this. And that's what I wanted to maybe I think we need to think through how to understand how Latin America is positioning itself in the face of these multiple challenges. And I think Hendrik is absolutely right that the challenges seen from both current and historical challenges from South America are different than the ones from Central America and certainly Mexico. The presence, military invasion in Central America and Mexico, not a new thing, but a military action like this in South America, albeit very limited, removing a leader, that's new, that's unprecedented. The historians on the panel will correct me, by my understanding is that, if I'm wrong, that the only previous time when the United States intervened militarily in South America was in the 1820s, maybe, to help Britain take over the Falkland Islands. But I saw that somewhere. I don't know if I stand corrected if that's wrong. But intervening militarily the way that they did in Venezuela is new. So things have changed. And what comes next? There are many alternatives.
I'll just jump in on this. I mean, the one example I think of where the Americans did do that before was, of course, Panama with the seizure of Noriega. They did do that. You may say it's a little different. Okay.
Historically, South America, former province of Colombia.
But to get back to the question, I would say, though, one of the things I think you've got a panel of historians and political scientists that are looking outward. And one of the concerns I think that we do have to take serious is how much he has changed things internally. The restructuring of a young Supreme Court that says you can do whatever you want, you're not going to be held accountable, We've already heard how much he has changed the fundamental nature of the senior leadership of the American military. If you were a woman, if you were of color, and if you were anything to do with the JAGs, you have been removed from positions. I mean, you start with Pagan, the commander of the commandant of the Coast Guard, and it goes right down this field. So you've changed the Supreme Court. You've taken control of the Republican Party by understanding their weakness, which is the primary system, and you have the bucks to support it. Recognize the only two politicians that are actually within the Republican Party that speak up against him are the two that survive primary challenge, Murkowski and the one from Maine. What's her name? Collins. Those are the only two that speak up against him. And the third change, of course, is he's drastically politicizing the bureaucrats, and he's taken actions. I mean, let's face it, where is the NRA? Where are those that are talking about the Second Amendment? Whenever any Democratic president would say, hey, it's not a good idea to have people walking around with concealed weapons, look at the way that he's broken the spirit of the NRA. Where's the conversations that the last person that was a casualty is going? And the last point is he's so totally gotten away from I can never pronounce it. The law that says you can't use the military for domestic purposes. Thank you. So that's my concern, is that, okay, he's probably injured the international order, but I think he's injured the United States even more so.
Good afternoon. I just want to say it was an excellent lecture. My name is Miguel Blanco. I'm a member of the CAF. And my question has to do with threat credibility. So moving a bit beyond the hemisphere, but it is about the hemisphere. So when we look at the poor showing of Russia over 4 years relative to what everyone thought it would be 4 years ago, Chinese equipment isn't working very well in Thailand against Cambodian militias. How do you think, the panel writ large, the next administration and the one after that in the United States is going to respond when perhaps they don't see a world that is as dangerous as they thought overtly, covertly, sure, but they aren't really checked by other state actors and they feel like they're emboldened to act as they please, as the world hyperpower?
What's the question?
What do you think the incoming American administration will do with its defense policy if it turns out that it's stronger?
You want to try it? All right, I'll go after you.
The response is clear. I just think back to World War II. Remember, everybody said, oh, look at what a paper tiger the Soviets were when the Finns were able to push them. You think in the terms of the inability of Americans to have torpedoes that actually worked at the first phases of the Second World War. They're not going to be able to stand up against the Japanese. I do think your point is important because I think people will look at what's happening in Russia, what is happening with that, and say, aha, we don't have to be so more concerned. And therefore, the aggressor state gains the advantage because they are able to say, well, we're not really as mean as everybody is saying we are. And we've seen this is a historical precedent. I mean, American Navy and the German Navy, for that matter, not getting torpedoes that actually explode. I mean, it kind of stands it on its head in terms of the capabilities, but they didn't. They didn't have it. And the way the Finns held the Soviets, everybody thought that just said that they were paper tigers. And I think that that's a real danger if, in fact, the Americans go down that road.
David.
I'm going to answer your question in a different way. I think that we are giving Mr. Trump too much credit for being a prime mover in American and international affairs. He is a man with a very, very sensitive sense of self-importance. He is trying to change trends and tendencies both in North America and in Europe and with NATO that are deeply entrenched. These changes will not last. At the same time, we Canadians have lost sight of what we have accomplished in this country over the last 140 years. Against tremendous odds of geography and climate and regionalism, you've got Kansas City Railway being bought out by Canadian Pacific. It is now the largest railway in North America. Somebody who made those decisions decided that there was a great future, and I'm not talking about 10 years, I'm talking about 50 years to 100 years, in a transcontinental Canadian railway that also reaches all the way down into Mexico. We don't think about that. If you drive through the United States and you look at the banking system down there, how many times are you going to see TD Bank or Bank of Nova Scotia or RBC? We have penetrated the banking market in the United States to a tremendous extent. Nobody ever thinks about that. And I could go on and on and on. These are trends and tendencies that have been producing themselves or have reproducing themselves over the last 100 and X years. If you think one man can change all of this, one man with a very thin skin can change all of this very quickly, I don't believe it. So what I worry about is not that you will see a drastic change. We may not have seen a drastic change, because Trump also represents tendencies in American politics that go back to Shays' Rebellion and the Whiskey's Rebellion, right after the American Revolution. Those tendencies have been there for a long, long time. Somehow, all of this came together. Maybe it was the fault of the Democrats who lost their way. Maybe it was just a lot of extremism in American politics coming together, as it almost did in the 1930s. It can't happen here. Read the book, okay? Maybe. I don't know what the answer is. But what I do know is that we are losing sight of what we have been able to accomplish. We're losing sight of the strengths that we have shown. We are here despite the United States. That goes back to the War of 1812, 1814. We're here despite the United States. And we're still here despite the United States. So I think we need to remember that. So it's not, we focus too much on Trump. That's what we do, because he sucks all the air out of the room. So we all know that. He focuses too much on Trump. He changes his mind. He's a genius when it comes to keeping everybody's attention focused on him. But let's try to get below the surface and see what's really going on. That's my answer to your question.
Finally, we have one last question.
All right, thank you so much. My name is Gershon. So I want to find out from the panelists, from which position do you think Trump is actually conducting his foreign policy? Is it from a position of threat or fear, a position of strength, which means the US has the strength militarily, economically to do what he's doing, or from a position of opportunity? Because if we understand the position from which he's operating, basically we can also find a solution to what he's doing. So from your perspective, which position do you think he's operating from?
Anyone want to take it up?
I want to start with a somewhat flippant answer that might get us somewhere. Don't ignore corruption. You can see, especially in the Venezuelan part of it, creating a separate fund stored in Qatar that allows Trump to make personal deals, and so much of his foreign policy follows his real estate business. I mean, if he's not getting paid, he's not doing it. Now, that is not a great path, but I'm not sure that really fits into any sort of, realist internationalist thing. This guy is, in many ways, out of the world of the mafioso, and that, if you thought about that as foreign policy, that could explain a lot.
Sorry, so can I add to that?
I'm not the fan.
What about Mark Carney? What about Mark Carney and his?
You know what? I want to hear from the other panelists, ma'am. We can trash our current government after they're done. Is that okay?
No, because you're talking about.
Oh my goodness! All right.
Trump acting in his own self-interest. What about Mark Carney?
Okay, if you want to do this, so I'm not defending Carney, but are you telling me that Carney has invaded another country, seized their oil, created a slush fund for himself in the Middle East? If he's done that, that's you've broken some real news. But I don't think you're going to find examples anywhere on a par with the cryptocurrency deals being done by Trump, with his demands for payment from Microsoft and other major companies, and frankly, the comparison is to me, it's ridiculous. So that's what you asked. You got a response.
Does anyone else on the panel want to?
I just wanted to jump in. I think what the point Dr. Towers is making is that the U.S. president's primary political and diplomatic motivation, above all else, appears to be his own economic and personal self-interests and those of other wealthy Americans close to him, in a way that I don't think that we can really say that for just about any other contemporary world leader. Now, in terms of the precedent that was asked, the first question, I think, there is precedent, obviously, for U.S. annexing neighboring territory, but the precedent is so outdated by this point that it's to become almost unprecedented. I think the primary anxiety, and here I'm echoing some of the other fellow panelists that I have, is the breakdown of American institutional mores. If you look back historically, most of these acts of US aggression towards its neighbors happened at points where American institutionalism and constitutionalism was ignored. And that's a precedent throughout US history. I mean, ignoring the Constitution, behaving in overstretching executive power, that's all happened before. So that is not entirely unprecedented. But most of it is rooted in the 19th century. And I would agree that none of the things that Trump has accomplished thus far are really going to be permanent and enduring beyond, say, the next decade or two, except for, I think, this tendency of challenging American institutions and mores, which that, I'm afraid, might become more routine.
Okay, well, I think we've actually reached our time limit here. And so what I'd like to do is, first of all, thank the panelists, thank the audience. I'd particularly like to thank Alex and Amelia, who've handled all the technical sides here. Thank you. And finally, let me note 3 more events being put on by CMSS in the next couple of months. On February the 25th, there'll be a seminar on Canada and the Golden Dome with Rob Hubert, a professor of physics and astronomy at the University of Illinois, and one of our own students, Gavin John. On March the 19th, one of the leading Canadian defense journalists, Murray Brewster, is going to be giving a lecture at the Museum of the Regiments on defense journalism. And finally, on March 26th to 27th, there will be a very large conference on Canadian land power being held in Calgary. So we are continuing to put on more events than we can possibly handle. So thank you very much, and I'm glad that you came, and I'm glad that our panelists are here. Thank you.